And we're just giving folks a very brief second to start filing in. Zoom's a little bit goofy in terms of the way it only lets people in now. So as you're filing in, just make sure you can let me know you're hearing the sound of my voice. I'm really excited to have this really great audience here for what is going to be an absolutely brilliant panel on science communication. Folks, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for joining us for the BioCord Summer Conference. I am delighted to be here. I'm so excited for just the whole brilliant spectrum of talks we're going to have today, and I'm so excited to be hosting the very first talk we have on this. I am going to be giving about 45 more seconds for everyone to sort of file in, so be patient with us on the front end as the technical sort of gears of the conference start rolling together. So this should be brilliant. Just hold on one second, folks. As everyone starts filing in, seeing that chat section, beautiful, beautifully done. Really great to see all of this. And with that, Anja, do you feel comfortable with me just going ahead and starting lighting this candle, getting this started?
Of course, yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
Do it your way.
Brilliant. All right. And now coming to you live from California, America, this is the SciComm panel of the BioCord Summer Conference. Ladies and gentlemen, I am so excited to have you here today for what is going to be just a full court press conversation about the difficulties, challenges, and just really interesting frontiers we're having in science communication today. We have a brilliant range of panelists here, going from the actual beginnings of how science communication happens in terms of filtering scientific papers and getting that initial scientific research to the public, to educating folks, to building community around that education, to building the sort of front end of science communication as well in terms of SciComm as entertainment, and making sure that we are bringing as many people as possible into the absolutely brilliant world of STEM, as STEM, the needs for STEM professionals is greater than ever, and so getting as many people excited about STEM is absolutely critical. So very excited to have you all here today, our brilliant audience. Very excited to have our panelists here. Just a couple of housekeeping things on the front end. We have a lot of questions that have already been asked by BioCord members in terms of this panel, so we're kind of filled up in terms of questions. But if you do still have questions throughout the panel itself, folks, if you are on Discord in the BioCord server, you can go ahead and hit up the Summer Conference questions channel within Discord itself. Ask questions there. That's going to be the best way for the BioCord staff to get those questions to me. It's going to be hard for me to see the chat window due to some technical issues we have. But otherwise, if you get your questions into the Summer Conference questions space, that's going to be the best place for your questions to actually get answered during the panel itself. But at the same time, we do have quite a few that we're already rolling through. So just keep that in mind, ladies and gentlemen. Really excited to have all of that set up and all of that here. With that in mind, I want to go ahead and just introduce everyone, so you know all the voices you're going to be hearing, and also some of the faces you're going to be seeing. Some faces you can't see because some of us, broke their webcam. Classic. What are you gonna do? So I am the faceless voice hosting this panel. My name's Peter Starr. I'm the producer and host of This Glorious Clockwork, a new YouTube channel about biochemistry. I've been a science teacher everywhere from the United States of America to Busan, South Korea, to Moscow, Russia, to the northeastern corner of Thailand, to Perth, Western Australia. I have always been trying to bring more people into the brilliant world of STEM. Biology has been my passion my whole life. I was raised by a medical technologist, so that's essentially all my background, and that is the least interesting background we have here today because our panelists are absolutely astonishing. So I want to just go ahead and bring those panelists in because that's the real reason we're here. First up, the host of the conference itself and also the organizer of the conference, we have Unchit Singh, who is the CEO and co-founder of BioCord, also a master's student in mitochondria metabolism. He is, in terms of academic interests, the person I'm the most excited to be here as a biochemist. Like I'm just always I'm team mitochondria. I want our mitochondrial masters to rule over us. So Anshit, you did a brilliant job introducing the conference. You've done an amazing job organizing and building this conference with the rest of BioCord staff, and obviously BioCord is a brilliant resource for building community around life sciences education. So excited to have your perspective here in terms of like the bleeding edge of bringing science to a broader population. Anshit, how you doing today, man? What's good?
It's an amazing day. It's around 10:30 at the night, but I'm excited to be here, not sleepy at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's definitely going to be an interesting panel. I'm the most inexperienced among all of the panelists here, of course, but I'm glad to see what the other panelists have brought to the table. And I'm excited to learn how I can improve on my science communication skills, as well as how we can incorporate these things into the BioCord organization itself. so going forward, we can provide better resources and educational opportunities for our members.
Absolutely. And I think you're discounting yourself a little bit too, because, going through the future here, community is going to be an absolutely essential aspect of communicating, especially the life sciences, given how complicated it gets the further you get into your discipline. You don't have to, we don't have to, you don't have to, you don't have to talk to any person who's gone through the life sciences gauntlet without, being like, how was your first organic chemistry class and that sort of thing. And just getting through all of the the extraordinarily complicated barriers that come with studying the life sciences and even more advanced sciences, because we don't just have biology here today, folks. I'll get to that in a second. So really excited for the community aspect there. And then getting into the rest of our panelists, we also have Dr. Alexander Freeman from the University of Cambridge, who has had an absolutely brilliant career in communication. She's been at the BBC doing communication and is now currently at Cambridge. She is currently setting up she's part of the system by which both risk and medical information are how doctors sort of disseminate risk information as well as just information about the beginnings of science communication itself. She's also the developer of a brilliant new tool, Octopus, which is essentially trying to solve half of the problem that comes from scientific journals these days, where they are simultaneously a place to publish scientific research and also the place where the scientific record is held. Octopus is a brilliant system that helps increase searchability and make sure that we can build real connections and build real reviews and have it be the actual primary research document area in terms of making sure that we make scientific papers more accessible and make the discoverability of scientific information more accessible. Anyone who's ever had to do any more advanced research for advanced papers knows that it is a gauntlet getting through scientific articles and trying to find all of the connections. And practically half of a person's PhD is just building their web of papers that understand their discipline. Dr. Freeman, I am absolutely delighted to have you here. How are you today? You ready? Are you excited for this panel?
Absolutely, yeah. I can't wait to hear about everybody else's life stories. You make us all find it incredibly exciting.
I do what I can. Next up, we also have another brilliant communicator. Ladies and gentlemen, we got the person I'm geeking out the hardest for, unfortunately, of Dr. Brittany Anderton, who is an associate director of research talks at iBiology. I'm a huge fan of the work that iBiology does. If you don't know about iBiology, it is an absolutely brilliant YouTube channel and that explores really advanced concepts in life sciences and helps guide students and interested parties towards a deeper understanding of the life sciences, both from just an introductory standpoint, all the way up to master's level understandings of how life sciences works. She's been the lead producer in a lot of really incredible talks on iBiology, including one of my literal favorite YouTube videos about the most beautiful experiment of all biology. It's one of those experiments that doesn't get talked about a lot because it's just kind of taken for granted how the semi-conservatability of DNA replication was discovered. It is a beautiful, really humanistic piece. Dr. Brittany Anderton, I am just a huge fan of your work. Thank you so much for joining us today. How are you today? Did I get your background right? Is there anything you want me to add to make sure? Because I will geek out about iBiology literally for hours.
Peter, you have done such a good job advertising for us. Thank you so much. I have nothing to say on top of that. And thank you for your appreciation of the products that I've been working on. We have taken some new steps in terms of our production, and it's really nice to hear that people that I don't even know have seen that video and enjoy it. So thank you for sharing that.
It's paying off too. It's just so beautiful. Yeah, and again, thank you so much for being here. And then and then finally rounding us out here, not necessarily in the life sciences here at BioCorp, but definitely a SciComm legend, ladies and gentlemen. It's Dr. Stephen Grenade. It's literally Dr. Grenade, ladies and gentlemen, here in the panel with us. Dr. Grenade, you've been everything from a actual NASA engineer to a communicator for NASA itself, and just a general SciComm legend in terms of leading the science track at DragonCon, and currently you work in robots and sensors as well. I can't even begin to fathom your background in terms of making sure I can essentialize it down. You've had tech literally fly to space and help, save the Hubble Space Telescope. Not recently, though, unfortunately. The first time we had to save the Hubble Space Telescope. Just a lot of brilliant work, too, in terms of bringing some of the most complicated science that we have right now, like the very bleeding edge of physics itself. And folks, I know this is a life sciences conference, but biology is just applied physics after all. So it's always good to make sure we go back to our roots in the physical sciences as well. So Dr. Grenade, man, this is so great. Dr. Grenade, so glad to have you here today. How you doing, man? What's good?
I'm doing well. I'm very excited to be here, and I appreciate you letting a physicist sneak in here. I ran away from biology because I was very bad at it. So those who are in the life sciences, thank you very much. It was not something I was any good at.
I mean, it's the exact opposite here. Like I ran away from physics because I was terrified of all the calculus. And that's the thing about biology. They sneak up on you. They make you think, oh, there's no math here. You just got to memorize. But then you get all the way to junior year of college and like, here's the calculus in biology, and it's like, what? No, how dare like. So I'm just excited that all these disciplines eventually come together. And so again, biology is basically just physics with a couple of extra steps. Either way, audience, thank you so much for all the questions that are already coming in. I'm really excited to get into the actual meat of this panel. So now that we have introductions out of the way, let us go ahead and just roll through. And I just want to talk about everyone's journey into SciComm real fast, because this is something everyone in this panel is either, in their postdoc phase, right on the cusp of being in college or currently in that university track. And we are all beginning to wake up to the fact that it's not just doing the actual research, it's not just doing the science. So much of making sure that we are successful as STEM professionals is how we communicate that science. And so I'm just curious as to a lot of us have gone through this like really amazing journey of like going through academia, getting that PhD, and then gradually finding our place within the within communication itself. So since Dr. Grenade, since you're still on camera for whatever reason, that's just like the luck of Zoom. Take me through take me through how you kind of made the transition from literally building sensors, like first of all cooling atoms down with lasers, which I mean, best PhD ever maybe, to NASA, to building sensors, to expanding on that outside of like actual aerospace into actual science communication. Like, what is that path like, and what are your general thoughts on science communication now?
Well, mine was a very accidental and unplanned journey. It was sort of a random walk into science communication, because my day job is still doing engineering and sensor work and things of that nature. But in my undergraduate days, I was a member of the Major of the Month Club, but I never dropped any of them. So I came out with a degree in physics and a degree in theater arts, as well as chemistry and math. So I just had like a cornucopia of things and very carefully crammed 4 years into 5. And when I got out of grad school I live in Huntsville, Alabama, and some of my friends were volunteering for a science fiction convention called DragonCon that takes place in Atlanta over Labor Day weekend. And they said, well, you've got this theater and tech background. Can you come hang lights? Can you come run soundboards? Can you run cables under there? And I said, sure. And it turns out that DragonCon has, they have these different tracks. So you have like the science fiction literature track, and you have the superhero track, and all of these kinds of focus areas on different science fiction and fantasy media. But they also have what we call the reality tracks. There is a science track, a space track, a maker's robotics track, those kinds of things. And the then director of the science track heard that the technical operations crew had as one of their volunteers a physicist, a PhD, pulling cables under there, and thought that them having a pet physicist was really funny, and talked to me about, would you like to come give a talk on the science track? And I had been out of doing more academic research and really liked the idea of sort of forcing myself to go back into the literature and look at new developments and boil those down and bring them into an hour-long public talk for general audiences. And I kept doing that. And then when that director stepped down, the organization asked me to take over. And so for the past 7 years, I've had sort of this science communication playground of doing live science entertainment events for a handful of thousand people who come through that portion of DragonCon, because at this point, DragonCon draws in about 85,000 people over the weekend. And a significant fraction of them will actually come and listen to people talk about science and talk about where science and pop culture interact. So that's sort of how it all happened without me ever planning for it.
No, absolutely. And it's one of those things like a lot of these what you're going to find is a lot of these careers are deeply organic. You just kind of take the next step and the next step and the next step, and suddenly you find yourself, either leading a conference or hosting a panel discussion on a Friday morning in California, or, whatever it is. You'll find that career trajectories these days are multidimensional and branching. And it's one of those things that, like, as you think about your career and understand your fundamentals of communicating what you want to do in your STEM profession, just kind of go with the flow, because you'll see a lot of that really great growth. But let's talk about let's keep moving forward here. I want to see what SciComm is for everyone, and so I'm actually going to bring Dr. Anderton. I'm going to bring you back in because you have another very organic career. You have a PhD in cancer biology, and now you are basically creating the next generation of life sciences STEM enthusiasts over at iBiology. What's that journey? What's that journey like? What's that journey like? Like, what's the impetus there in terms of making the jump to communication? Like, was it always a passion for communication, or is it one of those things that, as you got really good at communicating what ultimately was a very complicated PhD in a very complicated area in life sciences, that you just had that natural aptitude and just kind of jumped into iBiology? I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey if you have a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start by saying that my journey was very circuitous. For those of you in the audience that are maybe undergrads, kudos to you for being here. I didn't even know the landscape of science communication, or that there were careers in science communication when I was an undergrad. I knew I loved biology, and so I considered everything from being a veterinarian to being a dentist to being a veterinary dentist to identifying cancer research as something that I like to do. I'll give a shout out for team metabolism. I actually studied cancer metabolism. So Peter and Anchut, I'm definitely there with you. So it really wasn't for me until graduate school, in my PhD, and in the thick of my PhD, maybe third or fourth year, that I began thinking about the next steps. And I was always gravitated towards connecting with people. I was very aware of careers in education as a possible route for me. But in my fourth year of my PhD, I began to recognize that there was maybe a disconnect between science and policy. And that was really my first step into science communication. That was the first flavor of science communication that I began to consider as a professional route. And I was a co-founder of the science policy group at UCSF, which is a successful graduate student group. It still exists. And I had the opportunity to lobby in Washington, DC, and in the state capital of California in Sacramento. And that got my wheels turning around. How do I take this hardcore, in-depth research that I'm doing at the bench and translate it in a way that is engaging and meaningful to people who are not scientists themselves, and particularly to people that are not cancer biologists, but care about the research that is being done around cancer. So those are my very first steps. And again, this was kind of midway through my PhD, towards the end. And around that time, I was having a reckoning with myself, recognizing that I didn't want to be at the bench anymore after my PhD. I was beginning to admit that to myself and come to terms with that, which is a little hard for any of you that are maybe in your PhD and in this webinar. There's this structure there, this expectation that you continue in the academic route. And so I was beginning to recognize that I wanted to move away from the bench and towards things that maybe were the flavor of education or communication. And around that time, I was doing a lot of outreach with a group called the Science and Education Health Partnership at UCSF, which puts scientists in the classroom in the local school district. And I was doing some reading of best practices in education, and I became aware that there was a literature around how to teach about science. And by extension, I became aware of the literature around how to communicate about science, that there are evidence-based best practices in these spaces. And I thought, okay, well, I still love academia. I still love thinking scientifically and talking to academics. I just don't want to be at the bench. So I applied for a science communication postdoctoral fellowship at UC Davis. I luckily was awarded that. And so I was able to do 3 years of research at UC Davis around the teaching and communication of biotechnology, taking the contentious debates that exist around GMOs and biotechnology and thinking about how we can connect with audiences and formulate strategic communication strategies or education strategies that help people make decisions for themselves, but be equipped to make those decisions in a responsible way.
Exactly, yeah, because it's one of those things where, like, you have so much complicated information to deal with that you also have to focus that information and make sure that it is presented in a way that is not overwhelming to lay folk. And I love that. I love building that context around what we're trying to communicate. And obviously just building the context around these very circuitous paths we've taken to get to where we are in terms of communicating what is ultimately one of the most complicated branches of science. But of course, that brings me to Dr. Alexander Freeman. I want to get a sense of your background as well, because you've gone, from science from math to life sciences to media, back to science, just all over the place. And now you're in a really interesting spot where you a lot of your research and a lot of your work focuses on that very first moment where scientific information is freshly released to the public, and it's part of your job to help focus and build context around that and make sure that people are communicating that understanding as best as possible, which I imagine in maybe the tail end of a international public health crisis has been an even more complicated role. And I would just love to hear, how that journey has helped you get to this very interesting point in both your career and just the general area of science communication around public health as well. If you have a second, that might be a little bit too broad of a point to jump on.
Well, I'll start with where I started. So I was one of those children that grows up absolutely fascinated by the natural world. So I was the dissecting the rat on the kitchen table and horrifying your parents at every possible opportunity with dead animals, and not coming home at night because you'd found a barn owl nest kind of child. And I was also watching all the amazing nature documentaries, and saw David Attenborough and thought that's what I wanted to do. So the rest of my path was kind of how do I get to do that? But I also read the books of Richard Dawkins and thought, oh wow, okay, there's more than just pretty pictures and wonderful stuff in nature. There's lots under the skin as well, and lots of really interesting ways of thinking about it. So I applied to study with Richard and got one of the few studentships to work with Richard. So I was very privileged there. And then when I finished my degree, and I wanted to carry on into making nature documentaries, I realized that you had to do an awful lot of field work, learning how to use cameras and learning how to do all that kind of field kind of work that you need to do to make natural history documentaries, and that nobody was going to actually pay you to do that. That was going to be unpaid. So I thought, well, I might as well do a PhD at the same time. So I did a PhD in order to get camera experience. So I did the two, and that meant at the end of my doctorate, I was able to go and get a job in television, and ended up going around the world with David Attenborough for several years. So that was kind of then, so I've got to where I wanted to go. Where do I go next? So I spent 10 years directing films and making science documentaries, and I moved more towards the harder science because I really like the challenge of how to get the most complicated scientific concepts to the broadest possible audience. So I played around a lot with not just television, but interactive websites and games and all of these kinds of ways of communicating complex science. And then in 2016, I completely changed and unexpectedly threw in my job at the BBC to set up this centre in Cambridge, where I thought it was going to be quite similar in that it's communicating evidence. But actually, I've realized that through all of my career, I was using emotions and very persuasive techniques to try and engage people. And what I'm doing now is trying to dispassionately show people, disconnect the emotions and show people evidence when they're in a really emotional situation. So if you've been diagnosed with cancer and you're trying to choose your therapy, you don't want somebody to engage your emotions. You want somebody to help you understand the numbers. So I'm working in that world now where we're trying to inform but not persuade. And then as I was doing that, I realized that there was a massive problem with the whole of science publication and how the evidence itself was so skewed by the fact that scientists are being encouraged to persuade when they write papers because they're trying to sell a story, and that the metrics of being a good scientist are exactly what I had as the metrics of being a good entertainment specialist, of how many people read your work, how much do they like it, how important can you make it sound, and that these metrics really skew the evidence base and even how we approach science, because there's so many negative findings that don't get published, but also people get, they're always trying to make it sound exciting when sometimes it's not really the world's biggest advance you've made. You've just made a really interesting finding, which other people in that area might want to build on. And they might want all your work in every failure and every protocol detail so that they can replicate it. But journals are kind of selling stories and wanting to make things a big general readership. And that's kind of underserving that science side. So that's how I got interested in Octopus, my big side project, to kind of try and help rectify that issue in science. So in a nutshell, that's how I've got to my rather complicated role at the moment.
Yeah, and frankly, it's also really insightful to, see, like, we're talking about science communication, we're talking about getting people excited about science, but you immediately get into this tension between, there's so much at the very bleeding edge of understanding, especially, and there's so many things you have to communicate, especially in the life sciences, that can be, existentially terrifying to people. And so those things need to be discussed dispassionately. And while you audience members are seeing, this need to, make your story as interesting as possible, I think we understand as people who are passionate about science, we just give me the data. Sometimes it's very important to make sure that these things are discussed dispassionately as well. And so, audience, what I want you to keep in mind as you roll through this panel and roll through how you think about yourself as somebody who's trying to be a STEM professional, be a researcher, and then be successful in this academia and in this economy, how you have to think about that tension, because those forces that kind of make you present your research as, air quotes, interestingly as possible can also help, obscure the research you're doing. And so you have to keep that tension in mind as you roll through, especially if you are, in cancer research, or as your metabolic research gets you to a place where you are, discussing things that can lead to terrifying moments to people, the discovery that, I have an autoimmune disease, or however else that works. That's a very specific example, but it's also very important to understand the very large forces that are pulling at every person in STEM as they think about how to communicate what they're doing, how to communicate the natural world around us, because the whole art of science is discovering these, very small details that add up to this very gorgeous whole. But it's one of those things where, like, if you say, like, my particular tiny corner of the STEM universe is the most interesting, because I have to say that in order to, get a good publication, get enough readership that I can get more funding later on, that tension can be a little weird, and you have to find the proper balance. So I love that we have this balance of panelists. And of course, right at the bleeding edge of that is community. And so Anchit Singh, CEO and co-founder of BioCord, I'd love to hear about your journey and in building BioCord in the last 2 years, how that's tied into the research you've been doing as well, just your impetus for creating what is the largest life sciences community on the internet right now, and perhaps one of the most productive in terms of helping people on their educational journeys as well as building connections and research. What's the impetus for BioCord? Tell me more. I mean, you don't have to tell me about it. I've been here since day one, basically. But tell the audience, like, what's the mission behind BioCord? What's your journey to building it? Take me through that real fast.
Yeah, sure. So I have the shortest journey of all of the panelists here. I just started out as a master's student. I've finished 1 year of my master's degree. I'm currently at my day job. I'm in the lab right now doing this panel. And the BioCord basically started as a pet project of mine. I had just graduated my bachelor's degree, and I had nothing to do for a while before my master's degree started. So I thought about creating some sort of a community to get like 10 bio nerds together and talk about biology all day, so to get some sort of a head start to go into the higher educations further. So it started off with me just making a random server on Discord with a goal of getting 10 or 15 people talking about biology every single day. And by some stroke of luck, I don't know what has happened, it has snowballed into this entire organization with over 14,000 members right now. And in a little over a year, we went from zero to hosting a conference with such eminent speakers. The journey has been incredible, and it simply started out as a place to talk about biology and nerd about all the various papers I read on that particular day. In terms of how it has helped me in my short career until now, I think having tons of discussions on various topics about metabolism in particular on the server has helped me hone my ideas about my own master's thesis project, as well as helping me explore newer areas of biology, which I would not have otherwise been able to talk to other people about. So we have people working in the industry, people who are PIs in different labs, and I can talk to them every single day and ask any questions that I have on the server. So I think that has greatly helped expand my horizons of what science is and how the scientific method can be applied to various problems that currently face humanity.
Exactly, because I think one thing too that you're underselling is just how interconnected everyone at BioCord is too, and how all these little connections help people in their research journeys as well, because of just how broad life sciences has gotten, especially in the last decade or so. Just how deeply specialized you have to be in order to have sort of a very, like, air quotes, long-term career in academia. You kind of get lost in your little rabbit hole, and just the interconnectivity you've kind of set up here is absolutely brilliant. And so half the fun of SciComm is discussing discovering demand. You put out what you think is a completely boring video about hemoglobin on YouTube, and it just blows up for some reason because, surprise, people are as interested about hemoglobin as you are, that sort of thing. And so
Yeah.
when you're going through this audience too, I want you to think about, what you're the most passionate about. And if you think your audience will air quotes think it's boring, it's not. There is so much demand. The internet is absolutely massive, and there are so many people who are just delighted by the area we are in terms of just making all these new and fantastic discoveries at the very edge of molecular biology, public health, everything else. I'm going to be obviously very molecular biased because that's where my understanding is, so people help drag me out of that. But let's get into some sort of the nuance and complications that come from science communication. We've done most of this panel on introductions, but that's enough for us to sort of really, again, explore the tensions here in terms of setting up our conversations about life sciences. So I actually want to. I'm going to bring this back to Dr. Anderton. Actually, in terms of like the mission at iBiology, I think one thing that we haven't really hit on here is the journey a lot of people have to make to go from the very beginning of understanding life sciences to that more advanced level. And so I would love to ask about just like that middle layer, like people who are already passionate about life sciences and need to get to the next level. Take me through your mission as a producer at iBiology. Like some of the assets you've produced are just spectacular in terms of recontextualizing what is essentially basic knowledge. How do you sort of think about bringing as many people to the life sciences table as possible? Like how do you sort of expand people's horizons with the work you're doing, with the lectures and docuseries you're producing?
Yeah, thanks, Peter, for that question. I think that's core to what I do as a producer at iBiology, is asking who an audience is for a given product and how we can convey information in a way to help that product meet the goals that we intend for that audience. And one thing to keep in mind is that no single effort is going to do it all, right? Everything is a piece in this big puzzle that is the problem of science communication. But more specifically to your question about kind of the science interested audience, how do we convey more about the process and the who's who of science to them? What we do at iBiology is we give a platform for scientists to share their authentic selves and to share their own experiences. And science is a human social endeavor. So there's not only the aspect of the nitty gritty details of that molecular research or that ecology research or whatever we're conveying, but there's a human aspect of it. What was exciting? What was surprising? What was frustrating? Who did you collaborate with? Science is a collaborative endeavor too. And with the products that we are moving towards now, such as that mesos install video, The Most Beautiful Experiment, I also lead produced a video on archaea. I encourage you to find it on YouTube. It's called The Archaea and the Tree of Life from iBiology. It's a very similar flavor. We have scientists tell about their fields, about their research through their own perspectives and contextualize it with the greater picture. And in that way, what we hope to do is scaffold all of these things about science that make science what it is in a way that's not strictly a stripped down version of content that's stale and boring.
Exactly. And also, audience, I am just heaving links at BioAccord staffers right now in terms of all of the YouTube videos that Dr. Anderton is referencing. So look out for those as well. I should be dropping, once the panel's over as well, I'll be dropping those into the actual summer conference channel on BioAccord. So if it's one of those things you don't feel like doing the search on YouTube, I got it right here in my notes. So I'll send those over as well. I highly encourage you to check out all the videos iBiology produces, especially, obviously, I've mentioned what my favorites are, so I'm not going to jump in it too much because I want to make sure we're nailing it for time. So we talk more about expanding this out and making sure we're careful in terms of finding this tension here. And so at the bleeding edge of that is the connection between science communication and pop culture. So Dr. Grenade, let me bring you back in just to get your views in terms of you're really at the place where the door is opened at the absolute widest. Dragon Con is absolutely gigantic, and there's a lot of connection between like the pop culture we have right now, science fiction, and then getting into the fundamental science. What challenges do you see in terms of like taking people who are interested in sort of like pop culture science and bringing them into the STEM world? Like what have you seen over the course of running the science track over at Dragon Con? Is it one of those things where you see a lot of fleeting interest and then eventually you see some folks who like kind of latch on and use their pop culture obsessions to fuel their STEM journey? Or what is it like there in terms of like the very, very highest sort of like biggest audience areas of science communication?
Well, it's definitely a mix, and to sort of echo what Dr. Anderton said, no one thing will be everything for everyone. No, even within DragonCon, over a weekend we will produce about 45 contact hours worth of stuff for people to engage with, and some of that is we're going to have more science-focused talks. So someone will talk about gravity waves, or someone will talk about CRISPR. Then we'll have the pop culture inflected things like this, science of Pacific Rim, or what would Baby Yoda eat? Let's talk about the metabolism and the food that Baby Yoda is always putting in his mouth. And then some of it is just sheer entertainment. We'll do variety shows and things like that. And those will draw in different audiences. The more pure, or pure is the wrong word, the more specific science-focused talks tend to bring in people who are interested in that scientific topic. The pop culture talks will bring in both people who are interested in the scientific topic being addressed, but also are fans of that particular media property. The entertainment stuff will tend to bring in people who just want to see scientists suffer on stage for doing things like PowerPoint karaoke when they have to improvise a talk to slides that they've never seen before. So a lot of the challenges, I think, for me are making sure that we have a breadth of different things that we're trying, different topics and different approaches to those topics, and making sure that we're bringing in folks who are also members of the community that we're talking to. I've seen a lot, especially early on when I first started talking on that track, you'd have people who would basically come in and cross their arms and grump about all the things that this movie gets wrong. And here's why your love of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is dumb. And that's no fun. And it's very off-putting. You ended up with a group of people who were enjoying being hateful towards these properties. And so we ended up sort of changing the approach, because in the same way that you want to show that science is a process and it is done by humans, you want to show that scientists are humans, and a lot of them like some of the same media that the people who are attending DragonCon do. I have people who will give their presentations to be on panels dressed up in cosplay and costumes of the characters that they love, because they enjoy this stuff too. And that's been one of the big challenges I found, is less on the audience side and more in finding like-minded folks who want to produce that kind of science communication stuff, and who are willing to take what are sometimes very deeply silly ideas very, very seriously, and with a iron steel core of science at the center of it. That's what I got. Do I need to improvise?
Oh, there's 2 levels of mute I've got on my board here, and I muted both of them. And I was like, I'm just going to talk to no one. So forgive me for that minor technical flub. What I was saying was, you're exactly, like, what I love about that answer is it's starting to get into just the advantages we have as science communicators, because SciComm has managed to, at the very least, a little bit avoid a lot of the issues that have kind of plagued other parts of mass communication, other parts of the internet. What you see, audience, as you're thinking about communicating what you do and like communicating on the internet, you'll see that these really powerful forces kind of that want to guide what exactly it is you talk about. You'll be chasing an algorithm on YouTube, or you'll be chasing, a bunch of hot takes on Twitter. The internet kind of is a machine that produces controversy, not by, actual physical design, but just by the way that these systems are structured. And so when you're looking at this, when you're thinking about communicating, audience, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is there are very powerful forces always acting on everything you do, even if you feel like your particular part of science communication is very small. Some of those powerful forces are deeply negative. How, a lot of people are kind of encouraged to eventually get into just the hot take zone, where they stoke controversy and say, this is why, this is why the Pacific Rim science is bad. Square cube law, fight me. That sort of thing. And what I've loved about science communication over just the past 3 years is sort of resisting that turn towards the insanely controversial and getting into the enthusiastic exploration of even just the silliest things, because it's a great great way to get into the scientific method, take the concept of Pacific Rim to its logical conclusion and see how it could work in, the physical reality you work in, so on and so forth. But that also gets into the negative side of things as well. We start communicating, scarier things. And so I guess that gets into the question of misinformation, because it's on everyone's mind. Everyone, especially in America, is just thinking about the absolute nightmare zone that is trying to communicate, especially in the public health sector, but just in science in general now, that everything's sort of like up for challenge, so to speak. Is that a huge distraction? Is that something that needs to be addressed constantly? And we're seeing like actual consequences from that happening in America right now. Like I'm literally I'm not wearing a mask right now, but the minute I step outside I'm going to have to, because here in California mask mandates are back, baby. Let's go. So Dr. Alexander Freeman, let me bring you back in here, because while this isn't like directly your focus, you kind of touch on this a lot as you sort of begin communicating evidence. And so how do you think about communicating evidence, especially in this era where lots of misinformation is just not being given equal weight, but these little pockets of the internet that only want to hear misinformation? And how has that sort of changed the way you think about presenting evidence? I remember your paper that you did earlier last year, where you talked about how people estimated the size and scope of the pandemic at first. And I'd love to just hear about like what it's like there at the bleeding edge as you're sort of talking to professionals as they come to terms with just the ludicrous problem that is, communicating these really important public health facts in an environment where a lot of people may not want to hear them. Like, what is that like? What are those tensions there?
I think, well, it's such a big area. So I think one of the problems actually is what is truth? What is true? What is misinformation? I mean, so often we all say, oh, we've got to make sure we crack down on misinformation. But there are so many areas of science, particularly, in a pandemic where there's so much new stuff, we don't actually know what's true. We don't know what's false, and people make mistakes. Earlier on in the pandemic, people were making mistakes about trying to draw a hard line and say, masks don't work, don't wear masks or whatever, because they were trying to go by what the current message was that was coming from an institution that they trusted. But actually the evidence the evidence base was very weak. So I think there's differences between absence of evidence and evidence of absence, which is a concept that we really struggle to communicate, that sometimes we just don't know yet. And that doesn't mean to say that we know it's not true. So I think that's one area where I think we can do better as science communicators, and about being more humble about the uncertainties that we have, because so much of science is very open still. We don't know a lot of the answers, but being able to say that just because we don't know everything doesn't mean that we don't know anything, and to be able to make clear where the edges of our knowledge are. And I think that's exciting to audiences. I mean, as a child, I chose biology because physics seemed to have had all the answers in the 17th century, and chemistry seemed to have had all the answers by at least the 18th, 19th century. Biology, it was like nobody knew anything. So it was exciting for me. And I think actually inspiring people by the fact that there's so much out there to discover, being humble about our certainty and our uncertainty, and being open about it, because trust is at the key to so much of the issues around misinformation. So many of the people who seek alternative explanations are seeking it because they don't trust the institutions that are giving them a particular answer. And they may have very good reasons not to trust them. And I think, science walks a very narrow line when science is not open about its uncertainty, because if you say something that then turns out to definitely be wrong in the not too distant future, then you're losing trust. And once you lose the trust, then people will go elsewhere for explanations for things. So I think it's a complicated area, but yeah, I'm all for being open about uncertainties and humble about our lack of knowledge.
That is a magnificent like skeleton key for unlocking kind of like a lot of the issues at the center of the whole miscommunication debate, because it's one of those things where as a scientist, as somebody who's in STEM, a lot of times you know you don't know the answer to a question and the entire field doesn't know, but you also see the path to understanding the answer. That's the glory of the scientific process. A lot of the time you know you don't know something, but you know that like within say 2 to 5 years it's possible to know if the right research is done, and that's when you can kind of uh, walk this line when you have to deal with this kind of mistrust of either your research audience or when you're dealing with somebody who's trying to understand like the very fuzzy edges of an issue, especially now during what is hopefully the tail end of a public health crisis. So keep that in mind, like not to use American language here, but you've got known unknowns and unknown unknowns, right? And that's something very cool because you can help people like start thinking scientifically as you communicate uncertainty. Like, yes, we don't know the exact answer here, but here's how we're going to get to that answer. And you don't have to give the exact specifics, but that's the beauty of the scientific process. Frankly, I've just loved going through all the nuances here as we sort of like get to the very edge of our time. So when Anshu, let me bring you back here as well. When you're thinking about the very complicated bleeding edge here, like what is your hope in terms of the empathy side here? Because at BioCord, you've had all sorts of interesting characters wander in, say their viewpoints. Like, I'm amazed that creationists are still trolling in the 2020s. Like, and just seeing like people come in with an agenda trying to sort of tear down the scientific process. How have you and the team sort of dealt with the complicated aspects there? And then just thinking about moving forward as we get to the very edge of the allotted time for this panel discussion, what are your hopes in terms of building a more equitable and more broad science communication process as an industry? Like, what are your hopes there?
I hope scientists, like in general, or everyone who is doing science in a professional setting, I hope they're more kind to people who are asking questions in good faith. It's sometimes over the internet, it's hard to know who is asking a question in good faith or is in bad faith. So by default, we assume all the questions have been asked in good faith, and we try to be patient with everyone who has any sort of hesitancy towards the concept, and we try to explain the scientific rationale behind certain things. So especially with the COVID-19 pandemic right now, we have a dedicated channel for questions about the pandemic, the vaccines and stuff like that. So we have quite a few people every single day come in to ask questions about the vaccine and how the vaccine is working. So it's very important to make the distinction between vaccine denial and vaccine hesitancy. And we want to provide the right kind of information to people who are simply hesitant about taking vaccines because they have been getting information from all the wrong sources. So if we start attacking every single person who is not going with the agenda, who's not going with the flow, we risk alienating every single person who is also associated with this particular questioner. So you have one person asking certain question, and if one of the one of the scientists starts attacking them, you don't know how many thousands of other people are also passively watching that particular discourse. So you risk alienating that one person, but also thousands of others who now have the idea that all the scientists are simply trying to do is push their own agenda without trying to get my viewpoint into consideration. So just being kinder overall and trying to assume everyone is doing this in good faith before making our own judgments will go a long way towards it. It has worked for us in at least at a smaller scale on the server, and we have given good information to a lot of people who have been seeking them.
I love that. I literally love that because it gets into, the empathic side here, and also one of the critical things you have to keep in mind as somebody who's communicating in these massive arenas on the internet is that the person, if you find yourself, arguing with somebody who is, coming at you in bad faith, has all of these assumptions about whatever topic you have and how you have to be wrong. Like you whatever reason you're in a Twitter thread with a flat earther, it happens to the best of us. It happens all the time. It's one of those things that's never your audience. The people who are watching that conversation, the people you're actually trying to engage with. And so it's sticking, to being gentle, sticking to sort of that empathic enthusiasm, and just assuming good faith and interacting with bad faith as best as you can. And that's how you bring it all together in terms of the whole journey, because when you interact with science communication, a lot of people, like in the past, like you watch a YouTube video and it gives you a definitive answer, like this is precisely what happens when you drop a chain from a tower, and it does that weird arching thing in the Stephen Mould sort of mold. But it's one of those things where you have to understand that you're going to be talking to not only thousands of people, but thousands of ideas in the individual mind of every single person you're trying to educate, and you never know what's going to be the moment that sparks somebody. For me, I was just sitting lazily in a introduction to biology class I didn't need to be in because I'd already done AP biology, and my professor just very casually referenced the fact that hemoglobin changes its conformation based on pH and a couple of other factors, which unlocked my whole world for biochem. You never know what's going to be the spark for people, and you never know where on your journey you're going to be able to provide hooks for folks as they continue their journey. Science is a process, not a definitive goal. And so what I've loved about this conversation is sort of getting into all the different factors and all the different stages of that journey, and I hope you take that away. Either way, panelists, I really appreciate your time. I'm going to go around real quick just for final thoughts. So Dr. Brittany Anderton, again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your brilliant work and your brilliant career. Any final thoughts for us before I go ahead and close this out? Anything you want to make sure we keep in mind as we think about the incredible complexities of communicating science to a broader audience?
Yeah, I appreciate all the thoughts shared here, and I echo so many of them. One thing maybe I'll restate is Anshit's take is don't think of science communication so much as gatekeeping, that if people don't see science the way that scientists see science, they're wrong and that they're anti-science. Your role as a science communicator is to bring people in, and doing that by thinking about who they are and what they care about and talking to them. And so don't ever underestimate the value of grassroots, small scale science communication efforts. Those can sometimes be the most powerful, especially when you're battling against misinformation.
Absolutely. The door is wide open. You just got to beckon people on in and, let them go down the path, so to speak. Again, thank you so much for your time. And then Dr. Alexander Freeman, again, you're at the really interesting intersection and the really very interesting beginning of the science communication process. I really appreciate your time. Any final thoughts for us before I go ahead and close out this panel?
I guess I'd say that always remember that science is a method and a way of finding things out. It's not a series of facts. So pretty much anything can be wrong. Just think about things from first principles, question everything, and be open-minded.
Hell yeah. Procedure, not dogma. Love it. And again, thank you so much for your time today. And then finally, Dr. Stephen Grenade, again, thank you so much for your time. Any final thoughts for us before I go ahead and close out this panel?
I think one of the things that we have really been doing and building in SciComm over the past decade plus is the power of forming communities and doing science communication in those communities. I think BioCord is an excellent example of you can create a community around communicating science, and we need lots of different ones because there are lots of different people with lots of different interests. So there is no one right way of doing that, but I definitely encourage in science communication, do not discount the power of community building.
Precisely, building the big table where people can have those conversations. And again, as a huge fan of BioCord, I couldn't agree with that more. And Anshit, since we're talking about BioCord and we're right here at the tail end, any final thoughts from you, and how would you like to end this panel? Again, thank you so much for building this brilliant conference. Thank you so much for giving us an amazing conversation to have here on Zoom. Any final thoughts from you before we go ahead and put a bow on it?
So I just like to add one thing to your statement that I was not alone in creating this conference. I had I had a team of 24 volunteers working around the clock to ensure that we could host this conference wonderfully, and it would not be nice of me to take all the credit for that. So and of course, what Dr. Grenade said and what Dr. Anderton said as well, the power of community building and the power of grassroots communication of science is something that is truly remarkable. I cannot pretend that I knew what I was doing 1 year ago when I started this community, but now a year down the line, I see the kind of impact we have created over the past 1 year, and the number of people we have interacted with, and the number of people who now have more knowledge than they did before, and knowledge from reliable sources. So I think the impact of communities like BioCord and other such wonderful communities on Discord and other platforms is very invisible, but over time this impact will grow, and eventually I hope we will have a more scientifically aware population.
Exactly, and it's one of those things where, it will always be on a spectrum. It'll always be something that happens gradually, much in the same way that we are ending this panel discussion quite gradually with all the perspectives I want to make sure we get here. But either way, audience, thank you so much for all your brilliant questions. Panelists, thank you so much for your time. I have loved every second of this. Audience, if you want to hear more from all these brilliant people, I'm going to be heaving links into the summer conference channel over at BioCord, so check that out. I'll be sort of like going, list by list for more things you can discover from our brilliant panelists as well. If you want to check out my YouTube channel, that's cool too, and I'll send you the link, don't worry. But either way, audience, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much to the brilliant BioCord team who has put together an amazing conference. Anshit, is our next talk going to start at the hour right after this? Like, are we like 6 minutes away from the next conversation? Yeah. Awesome. All right, so let's go ahead and close this out. Audience, we'll see you back here again in 6 minutes for our next talk. Either way, as always, we like to leave you with peace, love, and incremental knowledge. Everyone be well. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for